The morning frost clung to Eleanor Beckett's black wool dress like crystalline tears as she knelt beside the simple pine coffin, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the bitter February air. Her gloved fingers traced the rough wood where Jacob's name had been carved in hurried letters, Jacob Thomas Beckett, aged 42, beloved husband. The words felt pitifully inadequate for a man who had spent 15 years transforming wilderness into sanctuary, with nothing but determination and an unshakable faith in their shared future. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to drift back to their first autumn together, when Jacob had insisted she learn to handle his rifle, despite her protests that such skills were unladylike. "Come on, Ellie." He had coaxed his patient hands, guiding hers as she struggled with a heavy weapon. Out here being a lady might get you killed. The Henry rifle had felt impossibly cumbersome in her inexperienced grip, its weight throwing off her balance as she tried to sight down the barrel at the tin can he'd placed on a fence post 50 yards away. Her first shot had gone so wide, it startled a hawk from a nearby pine, and she'd nearly dropped the gun from the unexpected recoil. "Easy now," Jacob had murmured, stepping behind her to adjust her stance. His calloused hands had covered hers on the stock, his chest warm against her back, as he showed her how to breathe with the rhythm of aiming. "The rifle's not your enemy. It's a tool, like a hammer or a plow. Respect it, understand it, and it'll serve you well." They had spent the entire afternoon practicing, Jacob patiently correcting her form, teaching her to anticipate the recoil to squeeze rather than jerk the trigger. By sunset, she could hit the tin can 3 times out of 5, and her shoulder ached from the constant punishment of the rifle's kick. "Why is this so important to you?" she had asked as they walked back to the cabin, the rifle slung over Jacob's shoulder. He had been quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the darkening horizon with an alertness she hadn't fully understood then. "This territory's changing, Ellie. More settlers coming every month, pushing against land that's been Lakota hunting ground for generations. Water's getting scarce, good grazing's being claimed fast. When people get desperate, they do desperate things." He had paused at their door, turning to face her with an expression of profound seriousness. "I've got a feeling in my bones that trouble's coming. Maybe not this year, maybe not next, but it's coming. And when it does, I need to know you can protect yourself if I'm not here." She had laughed, then thinking his concerns overwrought. "You're not going anywhere, Jacob Beckett. I won't let you. Promise me something," he had said, ignoring her attempt at levity. "Promise me that if something happens to me, you won't just roll over and let the vultures pick at what we've built. Fight for it, Ellie. Fight for our dreams, even if I'm not there to fight beside you." She had promised, thinking it was just husband's natural protectiveness. Now kneeling beside his coffin in the frosted cemetery, she understood that Jacob had somehow sensed his own mortality, had been preparing her for this very moment, when she would need every skill he'd taught her. The Cinder Bluff Cemetery stretched before her in the pale dawn light, row upon row of weathered headstones, marking dreams that had died on this unforgiving frontier. She had expected to see familiar faces among the monuments this morning: Martha Henderson, who had helped birth half the babies in the territory; Reverend Collins, who had married them beneath the ancient cottonwood by Miller's Creek; the Schneider family, whose children had played games of tag around their cabin, while the adults discussed crops and weather and the endless challenges of frontier life. Instead, only one other mourner stood in the frosted grass, his presence as shocking as it was touching. Tashunka Sapa's weathered face remained impassive as he watched the eastern horizon. But Eleanor caught the subtle tension in his shoulders that spoke of a warrior perpetually ready for violence. The jagged scar running from his left temple to his jaw told its own story of survival in a land where mercy was often mistaken for weakness. His presence here violated every unwritten law of territorial society, where the line between white settler and Indian was drawn in blood and maintained through generations of mutual mistrust and fear. His clothes were travel-worn, but clean, the leather of his shirt soft with age and careful tending. Around his neck hung a small medicine pouch, and Eleanor noticed how his hand occasionally touched it, a gesture of prayer or protection, she couldn't tell which. That he had risked his life to attend Jacob's funeral spoke to depths of character that the bounty notices and wanted posters could never capture. "We should hurry this along," muttered Samuel Briggs, the town's undertaker, his rifle leaning against a granite angel whose wings had been chipped by countless prairie storms. Briggs was a thin, nervous man who had inherited his profession from his father and clearly wished he had chosen any other trade. His eyes darted between the tree line and the warrior like a rabbit watching for hawks. "Sun's coming up fast, and folks in town get mighty nervous about unusual gatherings like this." Eleanor's jaw tightened until her teeth ached. Unusual gatherings. As if honoring her husband's memory alongside the man he had saved was some form of seditious conspiracy. The townspeople had already made their position devastatingly clear. By their absence, Jacob Beckett's widow was now a pariah for refusing to accept their convenient fiction about how her husband had died. Jacob deserves proper words spoken over him. Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the grief threatening to crush her chest like a physical weight. She opened the worn leather Bible that had traveled with them from Ohio, its pages marked by years of shared evening readings and margin notes in Jacob's careful handwriting. He was a good man who believed kindness conquered hatred, that understanding could triumph over fear. As she began reading from the 23rd Psalm, memories flooded through her mind like water through a broken dam. Jacob teaching her to tend their small vegetable garden during their first spring, his hands gentle as he showed her how to transplant seedlings without damaging their delicate roots. Everything grows better when it's planted with hope, he had told her, and she had thought he was just being poetic. Now she understood he had been talking about more than vegetables. She remembered winter evenings by their fireplace. Jacob reading aloud from newspapers that were weeks old by the time they reached their remote ranch, both of them dreaming of the day when their territory would be civilized enough for regular mail delivery and real schools. "Someday, Ellie," he would say, his arm tightening around her shoulders, "we'll build a schoolhouse right here on our land. White children and Indian children learning side by side, growing up together without all this poisonous hatred their parents carry." It had seemed like an impossible dream, and then a beautiful fantasy that could never survive the harsh realities of frontier life. Now, with Jacob dead and his killer walking free, it felt like a cruel joke. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." She continued, her voice gaining strength with each familiar verse. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters." Still waters. Like the creek that ran through their land, and the water source that had first attracted Jacob's attention when they arrived in Colorado Territory 5 years ago. "This land will sustain 1,000 families someday," he had told her, knee-deep in the crystal stream with his pants rolled up like a schoolboy. "Clean water, rich soil, enough grass to support cattle from here to Kansas. We're not just building a ranch, Ellie, we're laying the foundation for something that will outlast us both. Your husband was good man," Tashunka Sapa said quietly as Eleanor finished the prayer. His English was careful but clear, each word chosen with deliberate precision that suggested intelligence far beyond what most settlers would credit an Indian with possessing. "In blizzard of 47, I was dying. Snow 3 feet deep, wind like ice knives cutting through soul and bone. He found me half frozen beside my dead horse, brought me to his barn, shared food and fire for 3 days until storm passed." Eleanor nodded, remembering that terrible winter when temperatures had dropped so low that breath froze in the air, and metal became painful to touch with bare skin. Jacob had disappeared for long stretches during the worst of it, claiming he was checking on livestock that had already been secured in the barn. She had worried, but trusted his judgment about ranch work. never guessing he was risking everything to save the life of a wounded Lakota warrior. He asked nothing, wanted nothing in return. Tashunka Sapa continued, his dark eyes distant with memory. Just said, man helps man when the world turns cold. That's the only law that matters when you strip away all the foolishness. He gave me his own blanket when mine was soaked with blood, and melted snow fed me soup with his own hands, when fever made me weak as newborn colt. The warrior's voice carried a weight that transcended the racial hatred poisoning their frontier community. Eleanor saw something in his scarred features that spoke of honor and loyalty qualities that seemed increasingly rare among her own people. When storm ended and I was strong enough to travel, he gave me provisions and showed me safe passage back to my people. Never spoke of reward or debt. But in Lakota way, such kindness creates bonds stronger than blood, deeper than tribal law. Today, I honor that bond, though it may cost me life. The sound of approaching horses cut through the morning stillness like a blade through silk, multiple riders moving with the measured pace of men who owned whatever they surveyed. Eleanor counted at least 8 horses cresting the hill that overlooked the cemetery, their silhouettes dark and ominous against the lightening sky. Even at this distance, she recognized the lead horseman's imposing figure. Wade Blackwell rode his massive black stallion like a feudal lord, surveying his domain, his silver spurs catching the first rays of sunlight and throwing them back like signals of his wealth and power. The man was built like a prize fighter, all broad shoulders and thick arms, but it was his cold, gray eyes that had made him legendary in 3 counties. Those eyes had stared down stronger men than most, turning them into stammering children with nothing more than patient silence and the implied threat of consequences for defiance. Behind him came his hired men, hardened cowboys, whose faces bore the permanent squint lines of men who spent their lives outdoors. Men whose loyalty extended exactly as far as their monthly wages and no further. Eleanor recognized several of them. Tom Grayson, who had once worked for her neighbor before Blackwell bought him away with promises of better pay. Pete Hawkins, a former buffalo hunter, whose profession had disappeared along with the great herds. And Carlos Mendez, a Mexican vaquero whose skill with horses was exceeded only by his willingness to ask no questions about his employer's business methods. Mrs. Beckett. Blackwell called out as he approached the cemetery gates, his voice carrying the false sympathy that ambitious men used when they needed to appear reasonable before witnesses. Mighty sorry to hear about Jacob. Terrible thing losing a good man to Indian raiders like that. The lie hung in the air, like gun smoke, obvious and poisonous to anyone who cared to examine it closely. Eleanor had smelled the coal oil that morning 3 days ago, had seen the deliberate splash patterns on the barn walls before the flames consumed all evidence. The fire had been too well placed, too perfectly timed to be the random violence of a raiding party. This had been calculated murder disguised as frontier savagery. Thank you for your concern, Wade. Eleanor replied carefully, noting how his men were spreading out in a practiced formation that would surround the cemetery within minutes. 8 armed men against herself and 1 wounded warrior, the mathematics of power, were brutally clear, and Blackwell wanted her to understand them perfectly. Though I must say, I'm surprised to see you here. You and Jacob never seemed to see eye to eye on business matters. Blackwell's laugh held all the warmth of a frozen creek in January. Now, Eleanor, business disagreements don't mean personal dislike. Jacob was a stubborn man about that water contract, but that's all water under the bridge now, isn't it? He paused, seeming to savor his own crude wordplay, like a man enjoying a private joke. Speaking of which, you can't possibly manage that ranch alone. Dangerous country for a woman by herself, especially with these Indian troubles getting worse every week. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken but forced her voice to remain steady. I've managed just fine for 3 days. Of course you have, and I do admire your spirit, I truly do. But these attacks are escalating something fierce. Just yesterday morning, they hit the Morrison spread about 10 miles south of here. Killed 2 good men and made off with a dozen head of prime cattle. Poor Morrison's beside himself with worry, talking about selling out and moving back east, where Christian folks can sleep safe in their beds. Blackwell gestured toward Tashunka Sapa with theatrical concern. And here you are, consorting with one of the very savages responsible for your husband's death. Eleanor felt Tashunka Sapa stiffen beside her, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. The warrior's dark eyes studied each of Blackwell's men in turn, memorizing faces and weapon positions with the practiced efficiency of someone who had survived by being smarter and more observant than his enemies. And that there's Tashunka Sapa Black Horse to civilized folks. Blackwell continued, his voice growing harder with each word. $50 bounty on his head for raiding supply wagons and murdering innocent settlers. Territory Marshal issued the warrant himself after that bloody business up at Copper Creek last month. Eleanor had heard the whispered stories that circulated through town like poison tales of savage attacks and butchered families that grew more lurid with each telling. Women crossed themselves when his name was mentioned, and children were warned that Black Horse would come for them if they didn't behave. But looking at the man who had stood vigil with her through the long night, she found it impossible to reconcile those stories with reality. "I don't care about bounties or warrants," she said, surprised by the steel that had crept into her voice. "This man has shown me more kindness and respect than anyone else in this territory since Jacob died." "Is that what he told you?" Blackwell's voice dripped with mock concern. "Ma'am, that Indian's got more blood on his hands than a slaughterhouse butcher. He's played you for a fool, counting on your grief to make you vulnerable to his lies." Eleanor felt anger flare in her chest like struck tinder. "The only fool here is someone who thinks I can't recognize honor when I see it. Jacob's dead." Blackwell replied, his false sympathy evaporating like morning dew. "And his widow needs protection from the animals that killed him. Lucky for you, I'm prepared to shoulder that burden." He leaned forward in his saddle, his gray eyes fixed on Eleanor with predatory intensity. "Sign over the ranch to me, Eleanor, and I'll see you safely to relatives back east. Nice little sum to start over with, far from all this frontier unpleasantness." The threat was unmistakable, wrapped in the language of reasonable business and neighborly concern. Eleanor had heard similar stories from other widows and struggling homesteaders who had found themselves in Blackwell's crosshairs' generous offers that became increasingly insistent until acceptance seemed like the only alternative to mysterious accidents or unexplained Indian raids. "And if I refuse?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer would seal her fate. Blackwell's smile never wavered, but his eyes went dead cold like winter ice over deep water. "Then I can't guarantee your safety from hostile Indians, Mrs. Beckett. Terrible things happen to folks who don't take proper precautions against savage attacks." His gaze shifted to Tashunka Sapa with obvious menace. "Especially when they're harboring known criminals and murderers." Samuel Briggs gathered his tools with trembling hands, his face pale as parchment in the dawn light. "I need to get back to town," he muttered, clearly desperate to escape before violence erupted around him. "Got other appointments today, other families needing services." "You do that, Samuel," Blackwell said pleasantly, never taking his eyes off Eleanor. "And be sure to spread the word. Anyone who helps this woman is working against the safety of every decent family in Cinder Bluff. Folks need to understand the consequences of poor judgment in matters of territorial security." As the undertaker scurried away like a frightened rabbit, Eleanor felt the full weight of her isolation settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. The town had already turned against her, blaming Jacob's death on Indian raiders and treating her like a pariah for questioning their convenient narrative. Now Blackwell was using that fear to justify his land grab, while eliminating any potential witnesses to his threats. "You've got until sundown to make your decision, Mrs. Beckett," Blackwell said, gathering his reins with practiced authority. "After that, well, accidents happen on the frontier. especially to folks who make poor choices about their associates. You make mistake. Tashunka Sapa spoke for the first time since Blackwell's arrival, his voice carrying quiet authority that seemed to fill the cemetery despite its measured tone. I know your voice, your hoarse faces of your men. You think Lakota people have no memory, no justice. Something flickered in Blackwell's expression, surprise perhaps, or momentary concern that the Indian had spoken with such confident intelligence. But whatever uncertainty he felt passed quickly, replaced by cold amusement. Indians getting uppity, boys. Might need to collect that bounty sooner than we originally planned. The men's hands moved to their weapons with practiced synchronization, and Eleanor stepped protectively closer to Tashunka Sapa. The warrior seemed entirely unafraid, his scarred face calm as carved stone as he continued studying each rider with unwavering attention, committing details to memory that might prove useful later. Sundown, Mrs. Beckett. Blackwell repeated, wheeling his stallion toward the cemetery gates. Choose wisely. It would be a terrible shame if you suffered the same unfortunate fate as your dear departed husband. As the riders thundered away, leaving dust clouds and the echo of hoofbeats rolling across the prairie, Eleanor found herself alone with Tashunka Sapa and her husband's unburied body. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the frost and revealing the full scope of her predicament with merciless clarity. Why risk your life for strangers? She asked the warrior, who remained statue still beside the coffin. Tashunka Sapa's dark eyes met hers, and she saw something there that transcended the artificial boundaries their society had constructed between red and white, civilized and savage. In Lakota way, dead of life is sacred thing. Your husband gave me second chance to breathe, to see sunrise, to return to my children. Such gift creates bonds stronger than blood, deeper than tribal law. Eleanor's throat constricted with emotion. You have children, 2 sons, 1 daughter. Wife died in smallpox winter 3 years past. Old pain colored his voice like smoke from a dying fire. Your husband asked about my family during the storm. When I told him of my loss, he said, "Man who loses wife but saves children has succeeded at life's most important work." His words gave me strength to continue living when grief made death seem easier. The simple declaration carried more weight than all of Blackwell's threats. Here was loyalty without condition, honor without expectation of reward. Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, not just grief anymore, but purpose burning bright as forge fire. Then we'd better finish this properly, she said, gesturing toward the open grave. Jacob deserves to rest before we face whatever's coming. They worked in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher, taking turns with a heavy iron shovel while the other kept watch for approaching riders. Eleanor's hands, softened by years of domestic work, quickly blistered against the rough wooden handle. But she refused to stop or even slow down. Each spadeful of earth that fell onto the pine coffin felt like a promise kept, a duty fulfilled, despite the threats circling them like hungry wolves. The physical labor felt surprisingly good after 3 days of helpless grief and paralyzing uncertainty. With each dig of the shovel, Eleanor felt her sorrow transforming into something harder and more useful: determination. Jacob had died for this land, for the dreams they had shared of building something lasting and good in this harsh country. She would not let his murderer steal that legacy without the fight of her life. As they worked, Tashunka Sapa taught her practical skills she had never needed before, but suddenly found essential for survival. How to distinguish the sound of approaching horses from the natural rhythm of wind through prairie grass. How to use the cemetery's stone monuments for defensive cover if shooting started in earnest. How to load and reload Jacob's old Henry rifle with the speed and efficiency that could mean the difference between life and death in the darkness. Your husband, he was soldier, Tashunka Sapa asked as they shared water from Eleanor's battered tin canteen. Michigan volunteers during the Mexican War, served under Colonel Morrison, the current fort commander's older brother. Eleanor wiped sweat from her forehead with her sleeve, leaving a streak of dirt across her pale skin. Jacob never talked much about the fighting, but sometimes I'd catch him staring at nothing with that haunted look veterans get. He'd mutter about seeing too much blood, too much unnecessary dying. Good man carries weight of necessary killing. The warrior observed his scarred face, thoughtful as he handed back the canteen. But war follows good men, like shadow follows body at noon. Cannot escape, cannot outrun, only learn to live with darkness it brings. The truth of that statement settled over them like dust from the grave. Neither had sought this conflict, but it had found them anyway, drawn by one man's greed and a community's willingness to let fear override justice and common decency. As Eleanor worked, she found herself remembering details from recent weeks that had seemed unimportant at the time, but now formed a disturbing pattern of preparation and growing concern. Jacob's increasing nervousness about their isolated location, constantly checking sight lines from their cabin windows. The way he had taken to checking and rechecking the locks on their doors each night before bed, sometimes getting up in the darkness to peer out at their land. His insistence on teaching her to handle the rifle despite her protests, that such skills were unladylike and unnecessary for a rancher's wife. He knew, she said, suddenly pausing in her digging to stare at the partially filled grave. Jacob knew something was going to happen. He was preparing for it, preparing me for it. Tashunka Sapa studied her face with sharp attention. What you mean by this? The past month, he was different. Watchful. Jumpy at sudden noises that never used to bother him. He started carrying his Colt everywhere, even to check on cattle in broad daylight, when there was no conceivable danger. And he kept talking about making sure our legal papers were properly filed with the territorial office, kept asking if I knew where he had stored the deed and water rights documents. Eleanor's voice grew more excited as the pieces fell into place like tumblers in a lock. He even wrote a letter to his brother back in Ohio telling him about our situation here. I thought he was just being overly cautious, maybe getting nervous about his age. A wise man prepares for danger, like hunter prepares for winter. The warrior said, nodding slowly. Your husband's last words about finding truth with him, seeking justice in the ground. Perhaps he left something important for you to discover. Eleanor recalled Jacob's dying message with crystal clarity, the words that had haunted her for 3 sleepless days and nights. Find the truth, Ellie. Buried with me. Seek justice in the ground. She had assumed he was speaking metaphorically about finding peace in death, about justice being served in the afterlife. But what if his meaning had been entirely literal? The grave. She whispered, her pulse quickening with sudden hope. What if he hid something in his coffin, evidence of some kind? Man who saves enemy's life is man who thinks far ahead. Tashunka Sapa agreed, his dark eyes reflecting her growing excitement. If he knew danger was coming for him, he would have prepared for it. Left me something to fight back with. Eleanor felt hope building despite their desperate situation. Jacob had always been methodical in everything he did, always planning 3 moves ahead, like a chess player. If he had sensed his death approaching, he would not have gone quietly into that final darkness. By midday, they had filled the grave completely and marked it with a simple wooden cross bearing Jacob's name and dates. Eleanor knelt beside the fresh earth, finally allowing herself to truly grieve, not just for her husband, but for the future they had planned and would never see. The children they had hoped to raise on this land, teaching them to appreciate both the harsh beauty of the frontier and the importance of treating all people with dignity. The school they had dreamed of building, where white and Indian children could learn together, growing up without the poisonous hatred that divided their parents' generation. The quiet evenings on their porch, watching sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, while they planned improvements to their ranch and discussed the letters from back east. He wanted to build something lasting. She said softly, placing her palm flat against the disturbed soil that covered her husband's body. Not just a ranch, but a place where different people could live together in peace. He used to say that hatred was like a prairie fire. It destroys everything in its path unless good people work together to stop it before it spreads. Tashunka Sapa was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face contemplative. Your husband spoke great wisdom. In my language we have saying, strong tree needs many different roots to survive the storm. Hatred makes people try to grow alone, makes them weak when winds of trouble come. They sat in comfortable silence beside the grave, sharing the simple meal. Eleanor had brought cold biscuits and dried beef that tasted like sawdust but provided necessary strength. The moment felt almost peaceful, a brief respite before the storm they both knew was coming. Tell me about your children, Eleanor said, genuinely curious about this man's life beyond the wanted posters and whispered stories. Tashunka Sapa's entire demeanor softened the warrior's mask, slipping to reveal a father's tender love. Little Wolf is 7 winters brave, like his mother was. Already he tracks rabbit, learns the ways of horse and bow. Stan's bear is 5 winters quiet child who sees much, speaks little wisdom. And my daughter, his voice caught slightly. She is 3 winters, calls herself Dancing Moon, because she loves to spin under stars until she falls down laughing. Eleanor felt her heart constrict with empathy. They must miss you terribly. They are safe with my sister's family, far from troubles here. But yes, they ask when their father returns. I tell them soon, but... He gestured vaguely at their situation. Now I am not certain. We'll get through this, Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. And when we do, maybe they could visit the ranch, meet your new partner. Tashunka Sapa raised an eyebrow. Partner? Eleanor surprised herself with a certainty in her voice. I can't run this place alone, and you can't keep living as a hunted man. Together, we might build something Jacob would be proud of. The warrior studied her face for a long moment, then nodded solemnly. Would be honor to help build such dream. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the cemetery, they saw dust rising from multiple directions, not just from Blackwell's ranch, but from town as well, and from the direction of other homesteads. Eleanor counted at least 3 separate groups of riders converging on Cinder Bluff like vultures gathering around a carcass. He's gathering every gun he can hire or intimidate. Eleanor said, her mouth going dry with fear as she watched the distant dust clouds. Many riders, but not all, will be skilled fighters. Tashunka Sapa observed with a warrior's trained eye for assessing enemy strength. Some will be farmers with old rifles they fire once a year at Harvest Festival. Others cowboys who shoot cattle, not men who shoot back. Fear makes people brave until bullets start flying, then many discover they prefer safety to glory. Eleanor looked around the cemetery with new eyes, studying its layout, like a general planning a battlefield. The stone monuments could provide excellent cover, and the clear sight lines toward the main entrance would give defenders a significant advantage. The old section of the cemetery contained several large mausoleums built by wealthy families, structures solid enough to stop rifle bullets, while the newer section offered better mobility between defensive positions. What if we don't fight in the open? She asked, an idea beginning to form. What if we make them come to us on ground? We choose... The warrior followed her gaze, his scarred face growing thoughtful as he assessed the terrain with professional interest. You think like soldier's daughter. Use high ground, make enemy attack uphill into prepared positions where they cannot use numbers to advantage. But we are still only 2 against many. Jacob always said that in defensive fighting, the better position matters more than superior numbers. Eleanor replied, checking the action of the Henry rifle with growing familiarity. She had 37 rounds for the repeating rifle, plus another 20 cartridges for Jacob's Colt revolver. Not much ammunition for a prolonged battle, but enough to make their enemies pay dearly for whatever victory they might achieve. As the sun touched the western peaks, painting the sky, the color of fresh blood, then they heard the approach of many horses, moving with the measured pace of men who had all day to complete their business. Eleanor's pulse hammered against her throat as dust clouds announced Blackwell's arrival with what looked like 15 armed men. They had come prepared for war, not negotiation. The riders spread out in a wide semicircle around the cemetery entrance, their weapons gleaming in the fading light like the teeth of some great predator. Eleanor recognized several faces from town men who had smiled and tipped their hats to her just days ago when she'd come in for supplies, now sitting their horses with grim purpose, ready to kill her for the crime of associating with the wrong person at the wrong time. Last chance, Mrs. Beckett. Blackwell's voice echoed across the cemetery from just outside the iron gates, carrying clearly in the still evening air. Come out peaceful with that deed in your hand, and nobody has to get hurt tonight. Eleanor and Tashunka Sapa had taken their position behind a massive granite monument, in the old section, their weapons loaded and ready. The warrior's hand briefly touched her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that gave her courage she had not known she possessed. "I'm not signing anything, Wade," she called back, surprised by the strength and clarity in her own voice. "This is my husband's resting place, and I'll defend it with my last breath." "So be it," Blackwell shouted back, his patience apparently exhausted. "Boys, we got ourselves an Indian sympathizer and a murdering savage. The territory's better off without both of them. Remember, try not to put too many holes in the woman until I get my hands on that deed." The first shot shattered the evening quiet like breaking glass bullets chipping stone mere inches from Eleanor's head and sending razor-sharp fragments spinning through the air. She ducked low behind the monument, her hands shaking violently as she tried to sight down the rifle barrel. The Henry felt impossibly heavy and unfamiliar, despite Tashunka Sapa's patient instruction throughout the day, and she could barely steady it against the monument's base. Her first shot's recoil jolted her shoulder painfully, the unexpected violence of it making her cry out in surprise. She had no idea whether the bullet had found its target, but the act of fighting back steadied her nerves considerably. She was no longer a helpless victim waiting for slaughter. She was a woman defending her home and her husband's memory with everything she had. Tashunka Sapa returned fire with deadly precision, each shot carefully aimed at the muzzle flashes that bloomed like deadly flowers in the gathering darkness. His rifle spoke with the authority of long experience, and Eleanor heard a man cry out in pain somewhere among the headstones, followed by angry cursing from multiple directions. The warrior's calm under fire gave her the confidence to take more careful aim with her second shot. Breathe, slow, squeeze, gentle. Tashunka Sapa reminded her between shots, his voice steady despite the bullets whining overhead like angry hornets. Rifle is tool, not weapon. Tools serve steady hand, and quiet heart fails nervous fingers and racing pulse. Eleanor tried to follow his advice, exhaling slowly as she lined up the sights on a figure moving between the headstones. This time she felt more confident as she squeezed the trigger and was rewarded with the satisfying sound of someone cursing creatively in the darkness. The battle raged as full night descended over the cemetery with gun flashes creating a hellish landscape of dancing shadows and acrid smoke that burned the eyes and throat. Eleanor's ears rang from the constant gunfire and her shoulder throbbed from the rifle's punishing recoil. Sharp stone chips flew from the monument as bullets struck close to her face, leaving tiny cuts on her cheek that stung with each drop of sweat. But her aim wasn't improving as much as she had hoped. Despite Tashunka Sapa's patient instruction, most of her shots still went wide of their intended targets. She was surviving on pure adrenaline and the warrior's expertise, not her own marksmanship. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. If something happened to her companion, she would be utterly helpless against experienced fighters. "They're trying to circle around us." Tashunka Sapa observed with professional calm, pointing toward movement among the monuments to their left. 3 men, maybe 4, working through old section to get behind our position. Very dangerous if they succeed. Eleanor peered through the darkness, catching glimpses of figures darting between headstones like deadly shadows. Her heart hammered with fear as she realized their defensive position could become a trap if enemies got behind them. "Can you stop them? Must leave you alone for short time." The warrior warned, his dark eyes reflecting the distant gun flashes. "You keep shooting at main group, make them think we both still here. Fire every few seconds at muzzle flashes. Don't try for accuracy, just make noise and keep their heads down. Most important thing is they believe 2 defenders still in position." Before Eleanor could voice her terror at being left alone, Tashunka Sapa melted into the shadows with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. She was suddenly alone behind the monument, surrounded by the whine of bullets and the acrid stench of gunpowder that made her eyes water and her nose burn. Her hands shook as she fired blindly at the flashes of enemy guns, more concerned with maintaining the illusion of 2 defenders than with hitting specific targets. The Henry's magazine was getting dangerously low. She had perhaps a dozen rounds left. And then she would have to rely on Jacob's revolver with its much shorter range. A figure appeared suddenly at the edge of her vision rifle, raised directly at her position. Eleanor swung the Henry around without conscious thought and fired, seeing the man stumble backward and fall heavily among the headstones. The reality of what she had done hit her like a physical blow. She had just shot another human being, possibly killed him in cold blood. But there was no time for moral reflection, as more shots rang out from multiple directions, bullets striking so close she could feel their wind on her skin. The sharp crack of Tashunka Sapa's rifle came from somewhere among the monuments, followed by an agonized scream that sent chills down Eleanor's spine despite the circumstances. The warrior was using the cemetery's confusing layout to his advantage, striking at Blackwell's flanking party from unexpected angles before disappearing back into the maze of stone markers and shadows. "How many of them are there?" one of Blackwell's men shouted in obvious panic. "Just the woman and the Indian." Another voice replied, though it carried less confidence than before. "But they know this ground better than we do. And that savage fights like 10 men. Eleanor smiled grimly as she reloaded the Henry with increasingly steady hands, despite missing most of her shots. Let them wonder and worry about shadows. Uncertainty would make Blackwell's hired guns nervous, more likely to make fatal mistakes in the darkness that pressed around them like a living thing. Then disaster struck without warning. One of Blackwell's men had worked his way close enough to lob a burning torch onto the dry grass near Eleanor's position. The flame caught immediately, spreading with terrifying speed through the accumulated debris of autumn leaves and dead vegetation that carpeted the older section of the cemetery. Within seconds, hungry flames were racing through the graveyard like a living creature, consuming wooden grave markers and sending up clouds of smoke that made breathing difficult. The fire spread faster than Eleanor could have imagined possible, turning their defensive battlefield into a vision of hell itself. "Move now." Tashunka Sapa appeared beside her as sheets of flame raced toward their position with the speed of galloping horses. "Cannot fight here with fire coming. Must find new ground." They ran through the darkness with flames behind them, providing enough light for Blackwell's men to track their movement with deadly accuracy. More shots rang out, and Eleanor felt a bullet tug sharply at her heavy skirt, tearing the fabric. Another whistled past her left ear, close enough that she felt its wind on her skin and smelled the hot metal of its passage. Her lungs burned from exertion and smoke inhalation as they sprinted uphill toward the only shelter available, the old stone church that sat on a rise overlooking the town like a silent guardian. Behind them, the cemetery had become a roaring inferno, sending pillars of flame and glowing sparks high into the night sky. The fire would be visible for miles, Eleanor realized with mixed feelings of hope and dread. It might bring help from curious townspeople, or it might simply draw more enemies to finish what Blackwell had started. The church door hung open on rusted hinges, creaking ominously in the wind. As they stumbled inside, gasping for breath, Eleanor's legs shook from running, and she could barely grip the rifle through her exhaustion and the pain of multiple small cuts from flying stone chips. They had escaped immediate death, but their situation remained desperately precarious. Tashunka Sapa barricaded the door with a fallen wooden pew, while Eleanor checked the broken windows that offered views in all directions. The church had been abandoned for several years after the congregation moved to a larger building in town, and its wooden interior was dry as tinder, filled with the debris of neglect. Old hymnals lay scattered across the floor, their pages yellow with age and damp, and several pews had collapsed under the weight of their own decay. Not an ideal place for a prolonged siege, but infinitely better than dying in the open. "You are hurt," the warrior observed, noticing Eleanor favoring her left arm and the dark stain spreading through her torn sleeve. She looked down and was surprised to see crimson soaking the black fabric of her dress. A bullet had grazed her during their desperate escape, leaving a burning furrow across her upper arm that throbbed with each heartbeat. The wound was shallow but painful, and she could feel warm blood trickling down to her elbow. "I'll survive," she said through gritted teeth, though the injury made her realize how close death had come. Tashunka Sapa tore strips from his own shirt and bound the wound with gentle efficiency. His scarred hands surprisingly tender as he worked by the faint light filtering through broken windows. "You fight with great courage for rancher's wife," he said with what might have been approval mixed with concern. "I fight with desperation for a woman whose husband was murdered and whose home is threatened." Eleanor corrected, checking her remaining ammunition with growing concern. Less than 20 rounds left for the Henry Plus, perhaps a dozen cartridges for Jacob's Colt. "We can't hold them off much longer with what we have." Through the broken windows, they could see torches moving in the distance as Blackwell's men regrouped and searched systematically for their trail. The church sat on relatively open ground, with little cover between them and the burning cemetery below. Once their position was discovered, and it would be discovered soon, they would be trapped with limited ammunition and no hope of escape. "Your husband's final words," Tashunka Sapa said suddenly, his dark eyes intense in the flickering light of distant flames. "About finding truth with him, seeking justice in the ground. We must return to his grave while fire dies down." Eleanor stared at him as if he had lost his mind completely. "Return where the cemetery's a raging inferno. We'll be burned alive before we take 10 steps. Fire burns fast, but dies quickly without new fuel." The warrior pointed out with practical logic that made Eleanor pause. "Blackwell thinks we run far away to save our lives, not back toward greatest danger. And if your husband truly hid something important at his resting place, it could be destroyed by now." Eleanor protested, but even as she spoke, she was considering the desperate possibility. The newer section of the cemetery where Jacob lay had been uphill from where the fire started. The flames might have missed his grave entirely, or at least left whatever he had hidden intact. Or it survives, and we find evidence to stop this madness before more innocent people die. Tashunka Sapa said firmly. "Is worth terrible risk." Eleanor looked at their hopeless situation, trapped in a wooden church, with almost no ammunition, facing an enemy who could simply wait for dawn to pick them off at leisure, or burn them alive, like rats in a granary. At least at the cemetery they might find whatever Jacob had left behind, if anything existed beyond her desperate hope and a dying man's final words. "All right," she said, surprising herself with the decision. "But if we're wrong about this, then we die fighting beside your husband's grave," Tashunka Sapa said with simple dignity. "There are far worse ways for warriors to leave this world." They waited until the torchlights moved farther away toward the south, searching the hills and ravines where sensible fugitives might hide. then slipped out the back of the church into the ash-filled darkness. The cemetery still glowed with dying embers, most of the wooden markers consumed, but the stone monuments standing like ancient sentinels in a wasteland of char and destruction. The acrid smell of smoke mixed with the earthy scent of disturbed graves and burned vegetation, creating an atmosphere that seemed to belong more to nightmare than reality. Eleanor's heart pounded as they picked their way carefully through the blackened landscape, stepping around hot spots where flames still flickered among the debris and ashes. The fire had created perfect cover for their movement, so much ash and soot in the air that their footprints would be impossible to track even in daylight. But it had also eliminated most hiding places, leaving them exposed silhouettes against the glowing ground if anyone happened to look in their direction. Jacob's grave lay in the newer section, which had indeed suffered less fire damage than Eleanor had dared hope. The wooden cross still stood upright, though blackened on one side by the intense heat. The freshly turned earth remained largely undisturbed, protected by its slight elevation and the ring of stone monuments that surrounded it like guardian angels. Eleanor knelt beside the grave, her wounded arm throbbing, as she began to dig frantically with her bare hands, not caring about the pain or the dirt that packed under her fingernails. The soil was still soft from their earlier work, but digging by hand was slow and exhausting labor that made her shoulders ache. Each scoop of earth felt like an eternity, while Blackwell's men searched for them in the darkness, their torches growing closer with each passing minute. "Here," Tashunka Sapa said quietly, offering her a piece of twisted iron from a destroyed grave marker. "This will work better than fingers." They dug in desperate silence, both acutely aware that discovery would mean certain death and probably torture if Blackwell decided to make examples of them. Eleanor's hands grew raw and bloody from the rough work blisters forming and breaking and forming again. But she didn't slow down or complain. If Jacob had left her anything that could help her fight Blackwell's murderous greed, she would find it if she had to dig through 6 feet of earth with her bare hands. Her makeshift tool struck something solid about 18 inches down from the surface. Not wood, the coffin lay much deeper than that. Something smaller and harder wrapped in what felt like oiled canvas to protect it from moisture and decay. Eleanor's heart leapt with hope as she pulled the package from the earth, brushing away dirt and ash with trembling fingers that could barely feel what they were doing. Inside the waterproof wrapping were papers and a leather-bound journal, both in remarkably good condition considering their burial. Eleanor could barely make out the writing in the faint starlight and distant glow of embers, but she immediately recognized Jacob's careful penmanship on the journal's first page. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass, and I am no longer there to protect you. But they will not succeed in stealing what we built together, because you are stronger than they know and more loved than they understand. Seek justice, my beloved. The truth is all here documented and witnessed. Use it to build the future we dreamed of. Your devoted husband, Jacob." "What is it?" Tashunka Sapa asked, keeping careful watch while she examined their discovery with hands that shook from exhaustion and hope. Eleanor squinted at the documents, making out enough words in the darkness to set her pulse racing with excitement and rage in equal measure. Land deeds, water rights certificates, territorial surveys. And this journal is filled with Jacob's handwriting. He was keeping records, lots of them. She flipped through pages of meticulous documentation, catching fragments about protection payments, explicit threats, suspicious fires, and mysterious deaths by the light of distant embers. Jacob had been far more aware of the growing danger than she had realized, systematically recording evidence of what appeared to be a vast criminal enterprise. One entry made her blood run cold with fury. March 15th. Wade Blackwell visited again today, more insistent than ever about purchasing our water rights. When I politely declined his latest offer, he mentioned how unfortunate it would be if we suffered an Indian attack, like the Patterson place last month. The way he smiled when he said those words made my skin crawl with disgust and fear. I am now convinced beyond doubt that he orchestrated that massacre, and I intend to prove it before he strikes again. Your husband was gathering evidence against his own killer. Tashunka Sapa observed, reading over her shoulder with growing amazement. More than that. Eleanor's voice shook with rage as she continued reading by the faint light of dying embers. Look at this. He documented systematic intimidation and murder going back over 2 years. The Morrison Ranch attacked, the Schneider family massacre, the Patterson place burning. All of them blamed on Indian raids, but Jacob tracked a pattern that proves otherwise. The journal painted a horrifying picture of organized terror designed to drive out small ranchers and consolidate control over the territory's most valuable water sources. Blackwell hadn't just killed Jacob, he had orchestrated a campaign of genocide disguised as frontier violence, using racial hatred and fear to cover his systematic crimes. Another entry near the end nearly stopped Eleanor's heart. April 2nd spoke with Captain Morrison today when he visited town on military business. He mentioned casually that his brother Samuel has been asking questions about the recent Indian troubles, gathering testimony from survivors and cross-referencing attack patterns. Samuel Morrison is getting dangerously close to the truth about these fake raids. I fear for his safety and have decided to warn him directly, though it may put my own family at risk. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the final entries dated just days before Jacob's death. Her husband had discovered that Captain Morrison's older brother, the same Colonel Morrison he had served under during the Mexican War, had been murdered by Blackwell's men while investigating the false flag attacks. The evidence was all there, meticulously documented and cross-referenced with witness statements and official records. A sudden sound made them both freeze in absolute terror. The unmistakable creak of leather saddles and the soft snorting of horses being held in check. Riders were approaching the cemetery again, moving with the careful patience of experienced hunters who had finally cornered their prey. Check every grave in the new section, boys, came Blackwell's voice from the cemetery entrance, his tone suggesting he had figured out their destination through some combination of cunning and desperation. They came back here for something specific that the old man left behind. Spread out and search systematically. They can't have gone far on foot, and they're probably wounded. Eleanor's blood turned to ice water in her veins. He knew. Somehow Blackwell had guessed they would return to Jacob's grave, which meant he had probably overheard Jacob's dying words about burying the truth. The man was more clever and dangerous than she had given him credit for. And now they were trapped in the most exposed part of the cemetery, with nowhere to run. He was listening during the fire. She whispered to Tashunka Sapa, her voice barely audible. When Jacob was trapped in the barn, Blackwell must have been close enough to hear his final message to me. He's been waiting for this. The warrior nodded grimly and pointed toward the large stone mausoleum at the cemetery's far end. They could try to reach it, but crossing the open ground would almost certainly result in discovery and death. Eleanor looked at the precious papers in her hands, evidence that could bring justice for Jacob and all of Blackwell's other victims, then at her unlikely ally, who had risked everything to help her find the truth. A desperate plan began forming in her mind, born of exhaustion and terror, and the kind of clarity that sometimes comes when death is certain unless one takes extraordinary risks. I have an idea, she whispered, her mind racing with desperate calculation. But you have to trust me completely, even if what I do seems like betrayal or madness. She stood up slowly, clutching the documents against her chest, and stepped deliberately into the open space between grave markers. Wade, she called out, her voice carrying across the burned cemetery with surprising strength despite her fear. I know you're there, and I know what you're really after. I've found what you've been looking for. Tashunka Sapa's eyes widened in apparent shock and what might have been betrayal. But Eleanor gave him a subtle look that begged for patience and trust. She was gambling everything on her ability to read Blackwell's character correctly, betting that his overwhelming greed would make him careless when victory seemed within reach. "Well, well," Blackwell said as he rode closer through the ash-covered cemetery, 8 surviving men flanking him with weapons drawn and ready. Several others had clearly been lost in the firefight, which gave Eleanor grim satisfaction even in her terror. The widow's finally showing some sense. "Hand over whatever you found, and maybe I'll make your death quick and relatively painless. First, tell me why." Eleanor demanded, backing slowly toward a cluster of tall monuments, while drawing Blackwell deeper into the cemetery's maze of stone markers. She needed him close enough for what she was planning needed him talking, and distracted while Tashunka Sapa maneuvered into position. "Why burn down our barn? Why murder my husband in cold blood? What could possibly be worth all this killing and suffering?" Blackwell laughed, the sound echoing off the stone markers like the baying of a mad dog drunk on its own power. "Your precious little ranch sits on the sweetest water source in 3 counties, woman. Control that water and I control every rancher, every business, every settlement from here to the territorial capital and beyond. Water is power out here, and power translates directly into wealth beyond your simple imagination." Eleanor let disgust and contempt color her voice, hoping to goad him into revealing more. "So you murdered him for money. Just money. I tried to buy him out fair and square, offered him more than that land was worth by any reasonable measure." Blackwell replied without a trace of remorse or shame in his voice. But Jacob was too stubborn to accept a generous offer, too self-righteous to understand how business really works on the frontier. "So I decided to remove the obstacle permanently and take what I needed by more direct means." Eleanor felt physically sick at his casual indifference to human life. "You mean you decided to murder him in the most cowardly way possible?" "I hired some reliable men to stage a convincing Indian raid, planned to scare him into selling at a much more reasonable price." Blackwell continued with the air of a man explaining a particularly clever business strategy. "Wasn't supposed to trap him in that barn like a rat. But your husband was always too brave and too foolish for his own good. Tried to save those worthless horses instead of running like any sensible man would have done." The casual admission of premeditated murder made Eleanor's hands shake with barely controlled rage. Jacob had died trying to rescue their animals from what he thought was a genuine attack by hostile warriors. The other raids, the Patterson place, the Morrison, spread the Schneider family massacre. That was all you too, wasn't it? Easiest thing in the world once you understand the psychology involved. Blackwell boasted with obvious pride in his own cleverness. Dress up a few reliable men like Indians, hit some isolated homesteads when the men are away, kill anyone who might be able to identify the attackers later. Folks get scared and start looking desperately for someone strong enough to protect them from the savage menace. That's where I come in with my security services and my generous offers to buy out anyone who wants to relocate to safer territory back east. Eleanor wanted to vomit at the casual way he discussed the systematic murder of entire families. "You're talking about children. Innocent children who never hurt anyone. I'm talking about business, Mrs. Beckett, pure and simple." Blackwell corrected with cold practicality. "This territory is going to be civilized, eventually railroad connections, territorial statehood, federal law enforcement, all the trappings of modern progress. When that happens, the man who controls the water rights will be wealthy beyond imagination. I'm simply positioning myself to take advantage of inevitable historical forces." Eleanor had backed far enough into the cemetery that Blackwell was now well within the killing ground, and she had chosen his men spread out behind him in a loose formation that would work perfectly for what she hoped would happen next. "Those papers in my hand prove everything, don't they? That's why you need to destroy them and anyone who's read them. Your husband was an annoyingly thorough man, I'll grant him that much." Blackwell admitted, extending his hand with impatient greed. "Names, dates, witness statements, detailed descriptions of my business operations. Enough evidence to see me hanged 3 times over, if it ever reached the territorial capital or federal authorities. Eleanor clutched the journal tighter against her chest. What about Captain Morrison? Does he know his brother was murdered while investigating your fake raids? Something flickered in Blackwell's eyes, surprise mixed with genuine concern. Samuel Morrison was asking too many dangerous questions, getting too close to matters that didn't concern him or anyone else. He had to be silenced permanently before he could interfere with important territorial business. You killed a federal officer investigating crimes against civilians. I eliminated a threat to territorial stability and economic progress. Blackwell corrected coldly his patience, clearly wearing thin. Now stop wasting my valuable time and hand over those damning papers before I lose what little patience I have left entirely. Come and take them yourself, Eleanor said, reaching the shadow of the largest monument in the old section. That's when Tashunka Sapa struck from the darkness, like death itself given physical form. The warrior had used Eleanor's lengthy distraction to circle completely around behind Blackwell's men, and now he attacked with the silent efficiency of a predator who had survived countless battles against overwhelming odds. His knife found the nearest rider's kidney before the man could make a sound, sliding between ribs with surgical precision. The second rider began to turn in his saddle, just in time to receive Tashunka Sapa's tomahawk in the center of his chest, the steel head crunching through bone and cartilage with a sickening sound. Chaos erupted instantly as the remaining men fought to control their spooked horses while swinging their rifles toward this new and deadly threat. Eleanor dove behind the massive stone monument as bullets began flying in all directions, chipping ancient granite and sending razor-sharp fragments spinning through the air like deadly confetti. Through the confusion of gunfire and shouting, she could hear Tashunka Sapa moving like a vengeful spirit among the monuments, using every advantage the terrain offered to strike from unexpected angles before melting back into the maze of stone markers and shadows. His war cry echoed across the cemetery, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself and speak of battles fought by his ancestors on these same plains. Kill them both. Blackwell roared, struggling to control his rearing stallion while drawing his massive Colt revolver with practiced speed. I don't care about the Indian anymore. He's caused me enough trouble. But I need that woman alive until I get my hands on those papers. Eleanor peered around the monument and saw one of Blackwell's men advancing on foot rifle raised directly at her position and ready to fire. She didn't hesitate. Jacob's Henry rifle spoke with deadly authority, and the man dropped among the headstones with a bullet through his chest. The weapon's recoil sent fire through her wounded arm, but she ignored the pain and levered another round into the chamber with increasing confidence. An agonized scream echoed through the cemetery as Tashunka Sapa's blade found another victim. The warrior was using every trick of frontier warfare, striking without warning and vanishing before return fire could find him in the maze of monuments. But Eleanor could see blood darkening his shirt, where at least one bullet had found its mark, and his movements were beginning to slow with blood loss and exhaustion. Enough games. Blackwell dismounted with his revolver drawn, striding through the cemetery like an avenging demon who had grown tired of playing with his prey. Come out, woman. Your savage friend is bleeding to death. You're down to your last few bullets, and I'm done with this foolishness. End this now, and I'll make it quick. But Eleanor had been thinking during the battle, remembering everything Tashunka Sapa had taught her about using terrain to advantage and turning enemy strength against itself. The cemetery's layout offered one more desperate gambit, if she had the courage to attempt it. You want these papers so badly, Wade? She called out, stepping into the open with the Henry rifle in her right hand and the documents in her left. Then prove you're man enough to take them from a woman who knows what you really are. Dawn was beginning to break over the eastern peaks, casting long shadows across the cemetery battlefield and revealing the full scope of the carnage they had wrought. Bodies lay scattered among the monuments like broken dolls, testament to the deadly price of Blackwell's insatiable greed. Blackwell raised his massive revolver, his face twisted with rage and frustrated avarice that had consumed his soul completely. Stupid, stubborn woman. You could have died quick and easy. Now you'll suffer before you die. But as he squeezed the trigger, Eleanor did something he hadn't expected. Instead of standing her ground or attempting to run, she dove sideways toward Jacob's open grave, rolling behind the small mound of displaced earth that they had created during their frantic digging. Blackwell's shot went wide, the bullet striking a headstone and sending chips of marble flying. "You missed, Wade," she called out now, using Jacob's burial mound for cover while she caught her breath. "Just like you missed understanding the kind of man my husband really was." Blackwell advanced, slowly reloading his revolver as he walked with the confidence of a man who knew victory was inevitable. "Clever girl, but you're only delaying the inevitable. There's nowhere left to run and no one coming to save you. Am I?" Eleanor's voice carried a new note of confidence that made Blackwell pause uncertainly. "Because I've been thinking about what Jacob taught me during our years together. About how water flows downhill and how smart people use natural forces to their advantage instead of fighting against them." As she spoke, she was working frantically at something behind the grave mound that Blackwell couldn't see from his position. He could hear sounds of digging and scraping, but couldn't determine what she was attempting to accomplish. "What are you up to, woman?" he demanded, raising his voice to cover his growing uncertainty. Eleanor's answer came not in words, but in decisive action. She had used her knife to cut through the rope and wooden slats, holding one of the cemetery's old irrigation channels, closed a channel that collected rainwater and snowmelt from the higher ground and normally flowed harmlessly away from the burial area. But with the recent spring rains and strategic redirection using stones and her torn cloak, she had created something entirely different. The water came in a sudden, powerful rush, turning the ash and loose soil of the burned cemetery into slippery, treacherous mud that grabbed at boots and threw off balance. Blackwell, advancing confidently across what he thought was solid ground, suddenly found himself floundering in ankle-deep muck that made every step a struggle. "Now," Eleanor shouted to her companion. Tashunka Sapa, wounded but far from defeated, rose from behind a distant monument where he had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. His rifle spoke once, twice, and Blackwell's remaining men found themselves facing a coordinated attack from two directions while trying to maintain their footing on increasingly treacherous ground. Blackwell himself, caught completely off guard by the muddy trap, stumbled and fell heavily onto his back. His revolver went flying through the air, landing in a deep puddle several yards away, where it would be useless even if he could reach it. Eleanor was up and moving before he could recover Jacob's Henry rifle, trained steadily on his chest despite her wounded arm. "It's over, Wade," she said, standing over him with the rifle as steady as her voice. "You're finished." But Blackwell wasn't finished yet. Even flat on his back in cemetery mud, he managed one last desperate gambit born of pure rage and desperation. His hand found a jagged piece of broken headstone, and he hurled it at Eleanor's head with all his remaining strength. She ducked instinctively, but the motion threw off her balance on the slippery ground. As she fought to keep her footing, Blackwell rolled aside and began scrambling desperately toward his fallen revolver. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked like he might actually reach the weapon. That's when the sound of approaching horses filled the morning air. Not the chaotic noise of Blackwell's hired killers, but the measured, disciplined rhythm of military cavalry moving in formation. Captain Morrison from Fort Collins rode through the cemetery gates at the head of a full patrol, drawn by reports of the massive fire that had been visible for 30 miles in all directions. But Morrison's arrival wasn't the salvation Eleanor had hoped for. The captain pulled up short as he took in the shocking scene. Eleanor standing over a muddy, wounded Blackwell with a rifle, bodies scattered throughout the burned cemetery like casualties of a war, and Tashunka Sapa visible among the monuments with blood on his shirt and weapons in his hands. "Mrs. Beckett," Morrison said carefully, his own weapon half drawn as he assessed the situation. I need you to put down that rifle immediately and step away from Mr. Blackwell." Eleanor's heart sank as she realized that Morrison didn't understand the situation at all. To him, it must look like she and Tashunka Sapa were the aggressors, not the victims, defending themselves against systematic murder and land theft. "Captain, you don't understand what's happened here," she began desperately, but Morrison cut her off with military authority. "I understand there's been considerable violence here tonight, and I see a wanted man with weapons drawn." Morrison replied firmly, gesturing toward Tashunka Sapa with obvious suspicion. "I need both of you to surrender your weapons immediately and submit to military custody." Blackwell, seeing opportunity in the confusion, managed to sit up in the mud and put on the performance of his life. "Captain Morrison, thank God you've arrived in time." He gasped, his voice perfectly pitched to convey the impression of a grateful victim. "This woman and that savage attacked my men without any provocation whatsoever. They've gone completely mad with grief and bloodlust." Eleanor felt everything slipping away, like water through her fingers. After all they had endured, all they had discovered, it would end with Morrison believing Blackwell's lies and arresting the wrong people while the real criminal walked free. But she still had one card left to play, and she played it with everything she had. "Captain Morrison," she said loudly, making sure her voice carried clearly to all of his men who were listening intently. "Before you make any decisions that you'll regret for the rest of your life, I think you should know that Wade Blackwell just confessed to murdering your brother Samuel." The effect was immediate and electric. Morrison went rigid in his saddle, his face draining of color, as if she had struck him physically. "What did you say?" Samuel Morrison was investigating the pattern of so-called Indian raids in this territory. Eleanor continued, never taking her eyes off Blackwell, but raising her voice so every soldier could hear clearly. He was getting too close to the truth that these weren't Indian raids at all, but systematic murders staged by Blackwell and his men to steal land and water rights from legitimate settlers. "So Blackwell had your brother murdered to silence him permanently." "That's a damned lie," Blackwell snarled, but Eleanor pressed on relentlessly. "I have my husband's journal right here, Captain. Jacob documented everything over a period of 2 years, names, dates, witness statements, correspondence with your brother. And less than an hour ago, Wade Blackwell personally admitted to me that he ordered Samuel Morrison's death to prevent him from exposing this criminal conspiracy." Morrison's hand moved to his sidearm, but now it wasn't pointed at Eleanor. His voice was deadly quiet when he spoke. "Wade Blackwell, you have something to say about my brother's death." Blackwell looked around desperately, realizing that his situation had changed dramatically and probably fatally. "Now, see here, Morrison, you can't possibly believe the hysterical ravings of—" "I can believe the word of documented evidence." Morrison interrupted his voice, carrying the cold authority of military command. He dismounted and approached Eleanor carefully. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to examine that journal immediately." Eleanor handed over the precious document without hesitation, never taking her rifle off Blackwell. Morrison began reading by the light of his men's torches, his expression growing darker and more terrible with each page he turned. "Dear God in heaven," he whispered after several minutes of reading. "Samuel wrote to me about his suspicions, but I never imagined the scope of this genocide." He looked up at Blackwell with undisguised hatred burning in his eyes. "You murdering son of a bitch. You killed my brother for money. But you have no real proof." Blackwell protested desperately. "That journal could be fabricated, and even if it's not, it's just one dead man's paranoid delusions and wild theories." "Then explain the detailed confession you just made to Mrs. Beckett," said a new voice from the shadows. Everyone turned in surprise to see Sergeant Hayes, one of Morrison's most trusted non-commissioned officers, emerging from behind a large monument with his rifle at the ready. "Captain, you sent me to scout the perimeter while you approached from the main entrance. I've been listening to this entire conversation from concealment, and I heard every word Mr. Blackwell said about staging fake Indian raids and murdering civilians, including Colonel Morrison. Blackwell's face went ashen as he realized he had been overheard by a federal witness whose testimony would be unshakable in any territorial court. Sergeant Hayes, you will record everything you heard in your official report with complete accuracy, Morrison ordered. Then he turned to his men with the authority of command. Arrest Wade Blackwell on charges of murder conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and treason against the territorial government of Colorado. As soldiers moved to apprehend Blackwell, the man made one last desperate attempt to salvage his hopeless situation. Morrison, you're making a terrible mistake that will destroy your career, he shouted. I've got powerful connections all the way to Denver and Washington Cross me, and you'll find yourself court-martialed and cashiered out of the service. My career. Morrison's laugh was bitter as winter wind. You murdered my brother, you bastard. I don't give a damn about my career anymore. Meanwhile, Samuel Briggs had been watching the entire confrontation from the safety of a distant hill, his conscience finally overcoming his cowardice. As Blackwell was led away in chains, the undertaker approached Morrison with obvious reluctance. "The captain," Briggs said nervously. "I need to tell you something important. Yesterday evening, after I left the funeral, I went to Hannigan's saloon in town. The place was full of Blackwell's men, and they were talking freely about tonight's plans. They were joking about how they were going to finish off the widow and the Indian, then burn down her ranch and claim it was another raid. I should have warned someone, but I was too frightened." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Fear is understandable, Mr. Briggs. But you're speaking up now, and that takes courage." The next hour passed in controlled chaos as Morrison's men secured the scene, treated the wounded, and began the careful process of gathering evidence and taking statements. Eleanor found herself sitting beside Jacob's grave, emotionally drained, but finally at peace with the knowledge that justice would be served. Tashunka Sapa, his wound properly cleaned and bandaged by the military medic, approached her quietly. "It is finished," he said with simple finality. "Yes." Eleanor agreed, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. "It's finally finished." Captain Morrison joined them, his expression thoughtful and somewhat humbled. "Mrs. Beckett, I owe you a profound apology for my initial reaction to this situation. And I owe you a debt of gratitude that I can never fully repay for bringing my brother's killer to justice." Eleanor nodded acceptance. "What will happen to Tashunka Sapa? He's completely innocent of the charges against him." Morrison considered the question carefully. "Given the evidence we've uncovered tonight about systematic frame-ups and false accusations designed to cover up Blackwell's crimes, I'm recommending that all federal charges against him be dropped immediately pending a complete investigation. It seems clear that many innocent people have been wrongly accused as part of this conspiracy." And the bounty, Eleanor pressed, "suspended indefinitely. Any bounty hunter who attempts to collect on it will be arrested for interfering with a federal investigation." Morrison's voice carried absolute authority. "Mr. Tashunka Sapa is under the protection of the United States Army as a key witness in this case." As the sun climbed higher, painting the burned cemetery in shades of gold and amber that spoke of new beginnings, Eleanor stood with her unlikely partner beside Jacob's grave. The fire had burned itself out, leaving only ashes and the promise of new growth from soil enriched by destruction. The nightmare was finally over, but the real work, building something better from the ruins of hatred and greed, was just beginning. "What will you do now?" Tashunka Sapa asked, his dark eyes reflecting both exhaustion and hope. Eleanor looked at the papers that had cost so much to recover, then at the man who had risked everything to help her find truth and justice in a world that seemed determined to reward lies and violence. "We have a ranch to rebuild," she said with growing confidence. And I think Jacob would want us to build it strong enough that no one can ever burn it down again. The warrior nodded solemnly. Good plan. And perhaps we build schoolhouse too, like your husband dreamed. Teach children that people are people no matter color of skin or language they speak. Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile she had felt since Jacob's death. I think he would have liked that very much. But it won't be easy. There will be people who oppose us, who think we're making a mistake. Well, worthwhile things are never easy. Tashunka Sapa replied with the wisdom of someone who had survived by adapting to impossible circumstances. But we are strong together, and we have truth on our side. Captain Morrison approached them one final time as his men prepared to depart with their prisoners. Mrs. Beckett, if you need anything at all, you have only to send word to Fort Collins. The Army owes you a debt, and we pay our debts. Thank you, Captain. That means more than I can say. Your husband was clearly a man of exceptional character and courage, Morrison said with genuine respect. His evidence will help us root out corruption throughout the territory. The nation owes both of you more than we can ever repay. As the patrol prepared to escort Blackwell and his surviving accomplices to territorial court, Eleanor and Tashunka Sapa began the long walk back to what remained of their ranch. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of night and revealing the vast landscape that would now be their shared responsibility and their shared opportunity to build something lasting. First thing we do, Eleanor said, as they walked already envisioning the future they would create together, is rebuild that barn exactly as Jacob planned it, but stronger. He always said a ranch without a proper barn is just pretending to be civilized. Good plan. Tashunka Sapa agreed with the beginning of what might have been a smile. And we build with stone foundation thick walls. No man burns down stone. Eleanor nodded already, seeing the structure they would raise together, not just a building, but a symbol of resilience and partnership that would stand as permanent testament to Jacob's memory and the unlikely friendship born from his final gift of justice and truth. After that, we'll start on the schoolhouse. She added, remembering Jacob's dreams of bridging communities through education and understanding. Jacob always believed that hatred dies when children learn together, regardless of what their parents might think. Tashunka Sapa's eyes lit up with understanding and approval. In Lakota way, children are future of all people. Teach them to see past fear and old wounds, and tomorrow will be better than today. The funeral was finally over. The real work, the work of building something better from the ashes of hatred and greed, could now begin in earnest.